Okay, so here is our second video on liberalism. This one's going to be on the tensions and debates within liberalism, and we're going to look at some of the key thinkers as well. Okay, first of all, now in all your essays, you need to look at what liberals agree on first. Okay, so if you're going to look at what they disagree on, you also need to recognise what unites them and what makes this a kind of single philosophy or ideology. Okay, so what is it? Well, all liberals say they are concerned about freedom of the individual. Okay, as we're going to see later, they define that freedom a little bit differently, but they agree on freedom of individual. Also, they agree on equality of opportunity and rights. Now, how far they agree on equality of opportunity, again, differs, but they all sort of sign up to that. Okay, all of them, civil rights are important. Okay, they also agree that we shouldn't have tyrants in government, or we should have limited governments just in case we get someone who's not so sensible up there. Okay, they also all agree on the social contract. So this is the idea that government should be endorsed with consent from below. So it should be government by consent. And lastly, all liberals really agree in private property and free enterprise to an extent. Okay, so you won't get someone who describes themselves as a liberal wanting to smash capitalism or change it for some sort of alternative system. So, what are their differences? Well, we're going to look at two main differences. Really, the main differences on freedom and the main differences on the state. Okay, so let's take the classical liberals first, the sort of first liberals on the scene. Okay, so they're into something called egoistic freedom. Okay, ego meaning the individual or the person. So this was, like I say, this is from classical liberals, the likes of Locke and Mill and others. Okay, this also could be called freedom of choice or negative freedoms. Okay, so what they are understood as kind of legal rights. Okay, so the idea that people should and the idea is that people should take responsibility for themselves. So what legal rights? Well, they are things like the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to a fair trial, the right not to be imprisoned for no reason, etc., etc. Okay, so those are kind of legal rights, the base things that all liberals, by the way, agree on. Okay, now classical liberals said anything more than that is a bit dangerous, because actually they want to give people these freedoms, and then they think it's important that people take responsibility for themselves. Okay, going on a bit more, self-reliance is like a key virtue for classical liberals, as dependence undermines what they think is self-respect, and it damages the spirit of enterprise on which the economy depends. Okay, and actually we still get these kind of feelings these days, okay, particularly on the right, and people describe themselves as neoliberal or neoconservative. And let me show you a newspaper headline. Okay, so this is from the Daily Express, a right-wing conservative newspaper, and we've got 4 million scrounging families in Britain. Word scrounging, pretty negative, saying that there's nearly 400,000 households that have where no one has ever worked. Okay, so they're kind of pointing to this fact that if you give out handouts, if you give more than these negative freedoms to people tend to take the you know what I mean. Okay. On the other side, you have developmental freedom. Okay, so this is a different definition of freedom. Okay, this is how modern liberals think about freedom. They believe that negative freedom can often be no more than freedom to starve. Okay, so they said, look, you give them people these freedoms, but actually, if you're in the gutter in Victorian London, that freedom doesn't mean very much. So for them, freedom means the ability to sort of gain self-mastery and self-realization. Okay, so to do this, they think that we should all, have a decent education, have enough healthcare, all the things that we're not just worrying about our basic desires. Okay, our basic needs, not even desires, sorry, our basic needs. Okay, so they enlarge the concept of equality of opportunity to mean to liberate people from social ills such as poverty and unemployment misfortune. Okay, and I've got a sort of comparative headline here from the Independent, a sort of centrist paper, saying a generation left behind, UK's child poverty shame. So this is the idea. So think about it. What is child poverty? Well, if you're born into a household where you have nothing, you don't have the same opportunities, you may not have the same health prospects, you may not have all kinds of things, which means that this liberal idea of equality of opportunity, unless the state intervenes to help, isn't really true. Okay, so liberals have different ideas about freedom, different definitions of freedom, and this gives them a sort of different view on the state. But before we look at them in more detail, let's have a look at the similarities on the state. Okay, so starters, before we do this, all liberals think that we need a state. Okay, so even classical liberals think that we need like a night watchman state, something to enforce contracts and stuff like that. Both types of liberals also advocate limited government. Okay, so the protection of rights and usually decentralisation. An example here is in the 19th century, William Gladstone advocated home rule or self-government for Ireland. At the time, the UK was like, we can just rule everyone. But actually, if the government had listened to him then, it would have avoided a revolution and possibly lots of bloodshed. So there you go. He was quite forward thinking for his time. Okay, liberals don't revere the state though, like conservatives do. So conservatives like the state. They think it's this repository of accumulated wisdom, wisdom from the ages, and they think we need to listen to it no matter what. They subscribe to a mechanistic theory. Okay, so that means the state is like a machine, and it's sort of built to serve the individual. Ways that we can see it doing this, so reforms you could describe as liberal are the Human Rights Act, which protects our rights or further sort of codifies our rights, and devolution, which decentralizes power and gives power to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. Okay, so what are their differences in the state? Well, classical liberals, they only want enough state to enforce property contracts and other negative freedoms. Okay, so as we see, they only think that the state should interfere in people's lives when it's absolutely necessary to do so, i.e. when to protect property or to protect people's rights. Okay, so later thinkers went even further. So there's a guy called Herbert Spencer who actually coined survival of the fittest. I didn't know this, but I thought it was Darwin, but it was actually a guy called Herbert Spencer. He said he believed that those who survived were the best at adopting to their economic environment, and to interfere would artificially change the natural course of nature. So basically, what he's saying is, if you help someone to survive, they probably weren't the best person to survive anyway. So it's a bit like eugenics. It's a bit weird, but you can see what he's getting at. Okay, government intervention would be very likely to create dependency, as we looked at earlier, and inefficiency. Okay, so what do modern liberals believe? So, modern believe that they believe that negative freedom can be little more than the freedom to starve, as we said before. So, therefore, state intervention is necessary to ensure their definition of freedom and justice. So this grew out of so think about it. The difference really between modern liberals and classic liberals is thought, but it's also time. So as the Industrial Revolution went on, as poverty got worse in London or England generally, Manchester, all these like new urban centres, people looked around and goes, well, what is this freedom that we've won ourselves? So if you think Dickens, think Oliver Twist, people were living in really bad conditions. So modern liberals kind of start to think, hang on, do we need to do more to ensure this thing that we call freedom? Okay, so they were actually, at the time, they were called New Liberals. And they believed that if individuals were held back by circumstances, then the state had a duty to assist. Okay, so examples of early liberal reforms before World War I were old age pensions, national insurance, and labour exchanges, which were like the Victorian job centres, which I don't know what they look like. Probably pretty grim. Okay, so let's get on to the most famous example of a modern liberal intervention. Okay, so this is William Beveridge. He's a liberal, although his reforms were his report and the reforms that sort of spurred them were actually taken on by a Labour government. Okay, so here's a famous cartoon of him. So that's Beveridge wielding his sword, and these are the 5 great evils which plague our society, according to him. And you can see that we've got want, who's a thin-looking guy, ignorance, which is a sort of, I don't know why, but a fat, bold-looking guy, disease, which looks like he's about to cough or throw up, squalor, bit trampy, and idleness is just lying on the floor having a kip there. Okay, so he said basically that where these things exist, and you could call these poverty, lack of education, etc., where these things exist, you can, people aren't truly free. Okay, so his answer to these, as we know from our course, are he devised a welfare system and pensions and stuff to, or he prescribed it anyway, to combat want, a free universal education to a high standard to combat ignorance. Disease was combated with the National Health Service. Squalor, which was supposed to, there was a sort of big building program of slums and stuff after the war. And then idleness, we're going to come on to next. But as you can see, all of these 5 giants require state intervention, as in Beveridge, sort of symbolized by Beveridge with his sword there, in order to combat them. Okay, so they need state intervention in order to combat them. Okay, so the last one, the last great evil, idleness. I've sort of taken another slide because this goes another modern liberal economist. He would maybe not describe himself as a modern liberal, but he was one of the most famous economists of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, and his work tried to combat idleness. So what did he do? So Keynes was a bit of a genius, really. He wrote 2 famous books. One that predicted the dire consequence of the like really high reparations that were forced on Germany after World War One, called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and he was right about that. Let's not forget that. And the second that pretty much laid the foundations for the post-World War II economic order. Okay, so what is Keynesianism? So he argued it was government's responsibility to assure as close to full employment as possible, and to do this by managing demand. So if unemployment was rising, that usually meant there was a recession of some sort. Okay, so he thought this government would do this through public expenditure, i.e. sort of turning the money pump on. Okay, so you build roads, or you build hospitals, or you do something. Okay, so or you put money into the economy in some way. Okay, and you do this when the economy is contracting or slumping, and do that, it sort of boosts demand, and then you bring employment back up again. Okay, and he said that was the responsibility of government. Okay, so don't forget that particularly after the war there was like high unemployment and things like that, and this was his remedy, and it was very successful for a while. He was also bisexual, spent most of his time hanging out with artists and writers, and jointly negotiated all the Bretton Woods institutions. Okay, so he was quite a interesting character at the time. Okay, so we've had a little look. The 2 main strands. How different are they? Well, they're both concerned with freedom, but they have different definitions of freedom. They're both concerned about an all-powerful government. One is concerned that help from the state would create dependence and was counterproductive, and the other was concerned that the market could leave whole generations without meaningful equality of opportunity. Okay, so, but it's up to you in your essays to decide how different they are. Sort of modern liberalism and classical liberalism sort of were the 2 branches of the tree that turned into kind of right and left-wing politics in the UK. But maybe you can argue that with their starting point, they weren't that different. Okay, before we sort of conclude, let's have a little look at the thinker. Okay, so let's look at our first thinker, John Locke, although he's not Scottish, so forget about that. Okay, so he's quite an early thinker, as you can see from the dates there. He's also kind of serious looking, but everyone looked serious in those days. In his 2 treatises of government, he argues that firstly, 1, there is a social contract. So the idea that the governed give their consent to be governed in sort of exchange for security. They allow themselves to be governed, and in return, rulers govern them responsibly and sensibly and without abusing power. Or if they do, they get overthrown by the people. Okay, so and this is reflected in this idea of limited government based on consent from below. He also liked the idea, as we saw in the first video, of tolerance. This comes from his idea that the individual is special and unique and great, and that we should all respect each other and tolerate each other. Okay, so slight downsides to Locke, or something some people question, is it's unclear whether he believed in this thing called foundational equalities. He believed in these natural rights that we all have. Wasn't so sure if they applied between men and women. He also didn't extend his idea of toleration to atheism. Says you believe in what you like as long as you believe in something. And lastly, I'm going to put in purple at the end of these slides how we use them. Okay, so Locke is a really good example of classical liberalism. Not particularly for economics. He didn't talk about economics that much, and if you look at the dates, the economy as we know it today wouldn't have developed that much. Okay, but the idea of limited government, of individual rights, and the guarding against tyranny, Locke is a really, really good example. Maybe one of the first, thinkers to sort of overtly express this. Okay. Next thinker chronologically is Mary Wollstonecroft. Comes a bit later. She was a pretty cool woman for her day. She, in The Vindication of Rights of Women, which is her book, she argues that women are capable and rational beings, okay, which was a pretty out there claim back then. She said that women should enjoy the same civil liberties, the same foundational equality as men, should have the right to own property and vote and all of these things, okay. What we know as foundational equality, formal equality, the same legal rights. She died giving birth to Mary Shelley, who was the later author of Frankenstein. So we've got more than just women's equality to thank her for. Okay, how do we think about her? Well, on the sort of other side of it, she didn't go as far as many modern feminists in demand for equality, but given that she was, sort of working in the late 1800s, fair enough. She accepted that biology pointed many women towards motherhood, and she just wanted to give them a choice. So quite often modern feminists say actually it's a lot to do with conditioning and stuff like that as well, but she kind of said it's probably biological. Okay, so how do we use her? So she's also a good example of a classic liberal. Very forward-thinking if you think about the fact that she was a woman and what she was asking for at the time, but she was also classical liberal in that she just wanted this formal equality. Okay, she could be really useful to compare her to a modern liberal feminist like Betty Friedman, who I speak about later in this chapter. So that's probably how you would use. Okay, so who's the next thinker? We've got John Stuart Mill, or J.S. Mill, or JSM. So he was a very important liberal thinker, I think most people would recognise. Okay, so in his book On Liberty, he argues that individuals should be allowed to do anything unless it harms others. Okay, so what we call the harm principle. So he basically says, look, you have different actions. You have self-directed actions, which only affect the self, and you have other directed actions which affect other people. Okay, so there's a nice phrase which someone used, which I quite like. It says that the freedom of my fist ends at the tip of your nose. Okay, so i.e. At the point when an action starts to affect others, that is the point at which a government is allowed to intervene. When an action only affects yourself, it's fine. Okay, so he argued that, for instance, if someone wanted to drink their life away, that was fine as long as they didn't have dependent children, for example. Okay, so he says actually government action should not interfere with stuff apart from when it contravenes the harm principle. That was probably his most famous thing. So he argued that speech should be free unless it inspired violence, something we still kind of believe today. She said it was important to tolerate beliefs which are different from your own. And he believed in complete equality for men and women, which is quite radical for his day. Okay, He also maybe believed in some of these things because he had a slightly unconventional love life himself, where he lived with the love of his life and her husband for about 21 years until he died, and then John Stuart Mill married the woman who's called Harriet, I think. Okay, so later in life, he actually did accept some kind of government. So he accepted that to prevent enduring injustice to the poor, that should say, sorry, you should be allowed to have some kind of government. He also, to do this, he advocated a flat tax, and when he was in favour of inheritance tax. So he basically said, look, inheritance means that the poor sort of have long-term injustices over generations, and that, so maybe we should look into that. So, how to use him? So his insistence for no state intervention apart from to protect citizens from harms makes him kind of a hardcore classical liberal, in the sense that he sees negative freedoms and the role of government as very limited. Okay, but the rest of his life shows him that he starts to flirt with modern liberal ideas. This idea that actually the state should intervene to prevent injustice. So maybe you can start to see him as a bridge between the two types of thought. And actually, if you look at when he lived and when he was writing, that is probably sort of fair enough. Okay, so that's probably in line with when the new liberals or the modern liberals are starting to emerge. Okay, so let's have a look at a proper modern liberal. So we looked at John Rawls in the first video, and he is a very modern, much more modern liberal. Okay, and those are the dates where he was living and writing. So in A Theory of Justice, he argues that society must be fair and basically offer every individual a life worth living. Okay, so a fair society, he says, is one in which the difference between rich and poor is kept to a kind of a minimum. He accepted a degree of inequality, but argued that one should be happy to enter society. Do you remember his thought experiment? And so one should be happy to enter society at any level in order for it to be just. Okay, so what he called the original position. So if you want to design a society, he says it's fine. Imagine yourself to die and to enter it at any level, in any position, in any family, any skin colour, any gender. Are you happy? If not, go back, have another go at redesigning that society. Okay, so later, this is a little bit of a side note. Later, he accepted that in a pluralist society, not everyone would accept his model. So remember, a pluralist society is one where lots of it's fine to have competing voices and stuff like that. Therefore, he argued that actually maybe his truth wasn't a universal truth, but it would be enough to have overlapping consensus. Don't worry too much about this. I think it's more central, really, to and how to use John Rawls as a really good example of a modern liberal. Okay, so he's arguing powerfully why the idea of freedom entails notions of social justice. Okay, so and I like the use of his thought experiment. So he uses his thought experiment to kind of personalize the issue. He goes, okay, you like individual freedom? Imagine yourself in any position and see what that feels like. So I think he argues that quite powerfully. Okay, our last thinker is Betty Friedman. She's a liberal feminist, and so she thinks she's mostly concerned with equality between men and women. In her book, The Feminine Mystique, she argues that women are as capable as men, and oppressive laws and social views should be rejected. Okay, so she argues that women are held back from fulfilling their potential by unfair ideas and the type of employment they are suitable for. Okay, arguing that although many women choose to be housewives, this may lead to deep dissatisfaction for many women. Okay, because she was arguing at the time they were still being forced into this position. Okay, in sort of opposition to Wollstonecroft, she argues that not biology but conditioning leads to most of our gender differences. Okay, so we can see her work in a sense as a continuation of Wollstonecroft, and we can say, well, look, there's 200 years between them, so how much does that say about how much we've moved in this time? Although she's more of a modern liberal in that she argues for the extension of positive freedom. So she is emphasising fulfilment and not just negative freedoms like the property rights. So for instance, when Wollstonecroft was writing, women weren't allowed to own property. Even if you're a rich woman and you married a man, your property became his property. So Wollstonecroft is emphasising these sort of basic negative rights. Friedman is arguing for the fulfilment of women. Okay, so how do we use her? So, well, she's a very good example of a modern liberal. She could be used to compare her to Wollstonecroft, and for the arguments that you see above. Yeah, she could be used in an essay on freedom, and potentially on the state when it comes to re-education and stuff like that, or educating people. Okay, last little afterthought for this video is something that I think about is, we say, oh, you know, classical liberals are this and modern liberals are this, and something that I always think about is, well, how much are they a product of their time? Okay, so you can argue that you know, Locke and Mill, or Locke in particular, you know, he was just concerned about negative rights, and he wasn't concerned about the poor or the effects of inequality and stuff like that. But actually, they were, if they were living now, would they think differently when they see the inequalities that capitalism produced, or particularly that it produced in the late 19th century? Would they have a different opinion, or were they just sort of picking the fight that they had in front of them at the time? And you can probably extend that same argument to Wollstonecroft as you did to Locke, and to an extent Mill. Okay, well, I hope that helps, and let's leave it there.